Grace and peace, beloved of God. This is Apostle Cheryl L. Richardson, and we are broadcasting from Norfolk, Virginia. We have been traveling. Let me tag some of you folks. We have been traveling the past couple of weeks, and so we've been really busy. We thank God for you all stopping by to share with us in this broadcast of Shatter the Silence. We are praying that all is well with you and that you are continuing to enjoy the blessings of the Lord. I'm going to ask you to go ahead and share this broadcast when it hits your timeline. If you would share it, that would be amazing. We would greatly appreciate it. And want you to know that we all continue in prayer for you and pray the Lord's richest blessings upon you and yours. If you would share it, because those of you who follow me relatively closely know that that is not my strong suit. I do not remember to say share. That's not really what I'm good at. So, hey Leonard, hey Baston. So welcome again to another episode of Shatter the Silence. We're going to be talking about domestic violence because that's what the Lord has mandated us to focus on. And our topic today will be domestic violence and homelessness, because there is definitely a correlation between domestic violence. Hey, Rachel. Between domestic violence and homelessness. I'm going to try to wave to you all. Bear with me a second here. Again, I'm Apostle Cheryl Richardson. Hey, Katie. Hey, Annette. We're going to talk about homelessness and its relationship with domestic violence, how those two situations kind of interact with each other. And just to start, we've been on the road for the past couple of weeks, and so right now we're in Norfolk, Virginia. We'll be getting on another plane tomorrow, so continue to pray for us that the Lord will continue to keep us. We just participated in an amazing conference that focused on preventing family violence, and we were able to connect with some other amazing advocates that work with kids, that work at shelters, and our ministry leaders, and so we're really, really excited about that. And we've all really just renewed our commitment to addressing domestic violence, addressing child abuse, and those things that eat away and destroy the fabric of our families, right? Which is really the foundation of our society. And so, as you know, because I've shared this before, 1 in 4 women in the U.S. will experience domestic violence or intimate partner violence at some point in their life. So 1 in 4 women, 1 in 7 men. I try to be consistent in regard to stating that anyone can be a victim and anyone can be an abuser. So this is certainly not making a statement that only women are victims, because women can be abusers and women can be victims as well. It's just that the majority of reported cases, 80-something% of reported cases, hey Ree, are women reporting abuse. And it's important that you understand that we're talking about reported cases, because men most times don't report it. And if they do, they have a series of barriers and obstacles to receiving support. You know, people taking them seriously, maybe being ridiculed, or sometimes just the services not being available for men, for example. So female victims usually first experience domestic violence between the ages of 18 and 24. Usually, that's 38%, okay? 38.6%. And then followed by ages 11 through 27, that's 22.4%. And then ages 35 to 44 is 6 to 8%. And women ages 45 and over typically experience it for the first time, 2.5%. So what that means to me is most women experience it at a younger age, All right. And I think that the decrease in frequency as they get older is because they've learned what those red flags are. They're making different kinds of decisions regarding relationships. Hey, Dexter. So, just want you to bear that in mind, okay? Almost 1 out of 5, or 16.3% of murder victims were killed by an intimate partner. So these things are all interrelated. The risk of becoming an abuser is 2 times greater for those who were abused themselves as children. And we talked about this the last 2 sessions that we've had. We've talked about the impact of abuse, whether you experience it in childhood for the first time or in adulthood, that it absolutely has an impact on how you move forward in life and how you function, okay? And so your risk is 2 times greater of becoming an abuser if you have experienced abuse yourself as a child or witnessed your mother specifically being abused. And it also increases the likelihood of becoming a victim. Zion! Okay, so approximately 3.3 million children in the U.S. witness violence against their mothers or female caretaker by a family member. Think about that. 3.3 million children on average witness domestic violence. And we've talked about the fact that whether they're the direct target of the violence or not, it has an absolute impact. It traumatizes the brain. It wires the brain so that children then go forward in life being drawn to and seeking out the next person that's going to harm them. And so there's a physiological change that takes place in the brain. There's emotional changes that take place. And often when we experience trauma, we stop developing emotionally at the age in which we experience that trauma, which explains sometimes the childlike or childish response to stress or distress or argument, and an inability to regulate emotionally, okay? And it all goes back to what we've been exposed to as we were developing, okay? 40 to 60% of men who abuse women also abuse children. Now, it's important to focus on this, because if 40 to 60% of the men who abuse women also abuse children, it means that for a woman to stay in an abusive situation and assume, hey, Prophet Roger, and to assume that he's only targeting me with his anger, he's only targeting me with his abuse, okay, so up to 60% of them will eventually abuse the children directly as well. But even if he doesn't, they're being impacted negatively. Even if he doesn't, they're being impacted negatively. And it's kind of like the gift that keeps on giving. You know, it's as they mature and begin to move through life, it becomes evident that something happened back there, because they're not able to function. They're not able to respond appropriately. They're not able to discern healthy from unhealthy. And they're not able to build a strong sense of self-esteem, okay? 1 in 5 teenage girls say that they have been in a relationship where the boyfriend threatened violence or self-harm. So for those of you who have teenage children, you want to pay attention to their relationships. You want to pay attention. It doesn't matter if the boyfriend is the captain of the football team making straight A's. How is he treating your teenage daughter? What is he saying to her? Is he possessive? And this is a major, major problem for teens, because many of them will not share with their parents what they are actually experiencing. Hey, Eloise! Okay, so if 1 in 5 teenage girls say that they have been in a relationship where the boyfriend threatened to harm them, right, or threatened violence, or said, I'm going to kill myself, you know, some may think that, well, that's really romantic and that means he really loves me. What it means is he's mentally unstable, is what it means. And if he's mentally unstable and not valuing his own life, it's kind of foolhardy to assume that he's going to value the life of your daughter. All right? And for those who are adults, who are engaged in relationships with partners who are threatening to harm themselves, you are really taking a chance. You're really rolling the dice and making assumptions about how far that disdain and that lack of value for life actually, how far does it reach? How far does it reach? You understand what I'm saying? So it's important that we dispel these myths that we have and the way that we tend to romanticize things and understand how these things are related. Okay? As I stated previously, 85% of domestic violence victims, reported victims, are women. We know that men are also victims. Men rarely report for a lot of legitimate reasons. And that's something as a society that we must work on. Oftentimes men will stay in an abusive relationship because they don't want to lose their children. The same reasons that women stay, because they don't want to lose their children. Because it's easy for a woman to say, I've been abused by this person. It's more readily believed than when it's reported the other way around. Okay? So we're going to focus on homelessness and domestic violence today. It's often a contributing factor to homelessness. And so I want you to think about the times that maybe you're out in your own community or you're out about town and you see a homeless person and, you know, do you roll your window up as you approach that intersection? Do you make sure all the doors are locked? Do you assume that they all smell bad and that they're all drug addicted or incredibly psychotic and hallucinating and a danger and a threat? Do we assume, hey Vic, do we assume negative things about them? Do we assume that they are uneducated, that they lack drive or direction or ambition? Do we assume that they come from the wrong side of the tracks? What is it that you think when you encounter a homeless person? One of the things that I've done over the course of my career in mental health is I was the director of a homeless shelter for 4 years in the city of St. Louis. And I can tell you that I had people from all walks of life come through there. I had people with graduate degrees, doctoral degrees. I had people with undergrad degrees. I had people with GEDs, people with children, people with no children, some with a lot of children, some didn't even like children, men, women, all races. You know, everyone was equally represented. And their stories often involved domestic violence. Many of them were fleeing violent situations. So they weren't homeless because they just said, forget it, I'm not paying my rent. Forget it, I'm not paying my mortgage. I'm just going to be irresponsible. That's not what happened. They were running for their lives. They were seeking a safe place for themselves and for their families in some cases and for their children. And so there is a large segment of the homeless population that are domestic violence victims. And so they had to leave. They could not stay. If they wanted to live, they needed to leave. Okay? And so we want to dispel the myths. We want to dispel the myths. Now, and then you do have those who maybe are drug addicted. But even those, how many of them are domestic violence victims? How many of them, because I know I had residents in my shelter, how many of them had previously had an alcohol or drug issue, had gone through rehab, or had kicked it cold turkey, had been clean for a significant amount of time, and then got connected to the wrong individual who, in one form of domestic violence, encouraged, prodded, pushed, provoked them into using or picking up again. And so now they're actively addicted, and no matter what they've accomplished in their life prior to that, now they're facing homelessness, they are facing joblessness, they are facing being on the street. Again, because of a domestic violence relationship, okay? And so one form of domestic abuse is exploiting a weakness that the partner has. If you know that they have stopped drinking, they have stopped using drugs, right? And then you bring it around them, or you encourage them, or you throw it up in their face. You provoke them, you trigger them into picking up that substance or using again so that you can have control of them. This happens all the time. At some point, they're going to end up homeless. They're going to end up homeless because they're not going to work. They're going to end up homeless because they're not pulling their weight when they do go to work. They're missing work. Their health begins to fail. And so they end up on the street. And so we need to be careful, especially those of us who, name the name of Christ or call ourselves a people of faith or spiritual people, about assigning a value to people based on their address. Okay? Assigning a value to people based on their address. It's ugly. Okay? And there's nothing Christ-like about that. There's nothing spiritual about that. There's nothing okay about that. Hey, Dr. Jen. So 16% of homeless people are domestic violence victims, is what one statistic says. Okay? And I came across this article, and it was called Homeless Children and Youth, Causes and Consequences, and it was done by the National Center for Children in Poverty. And it said that more than 80% of mothers with children experiencing homelessness have previously experienced domestic violence. More than 80% of women with children experiencing homelessness have previously experienced domestic violence. And so the domestic violence has gotten so bad, hey Amber, that they have elected to be homeless rather than to continue to expose themselves and their children to this trauma, which we know actually impacts the brain. Okay? 84% of homeless women have experienced severe physical or sexual abuse at some time in their life. So when we see people on the street with their shopping cart or their shopping bags or appearing to wear every item of clothing that they own, holding a sign or whatever it is that they're doing out there, we need to try to understand that they have a story. And maybe the brave thing for them to do is to be on the street. Maybe their best chance of living is on the street. Okay? At least in that moment. The issue with being out there is now they are vulnerable to human trafficking. They're vulnerable to all sorts of things that out there in the street because it's unsafe. Okay? 63% of homeless women have been the victim of domestic violence as adults. As adults. How bad does it have to be for you to end up on the street as opposed to couch surfing with your best friends? Staying at your auntie's house or at your grandmama's house or at the next door neighbor's. How bad does it have to be? Think about that. For you to elect to go to the street as opposed to staying in an abusive situation. And then when they do make that choice, which takes a lot of courage, then they are met with ridicule and judgment and a system that is so complicated. I mean, I have five degrees, okay? So I'm reasonably well educated. And I find the system frustrating. And I promise you, I admire anybody that can navigate these systems that we have set up, all right, in the condition that they're in emotionally and spiritually and physically. Navigate these systems and hang on to their sanity at the same time. One of the things that I observed as the homeless shelter director in St. Louis was this. I realized that I needed to train my staff. And you can't teach people compassion, but you can try to get them to understand what a reasonable expectation is. And so here's an example of what a homeless person may experience going to a shelter. Typically, there are rules, right? Because funding for shelters, there's not a whole lot of it. And a lot of it is driven by grants, et cetera, et cetera. The people who extend the grants have different priorities that they've placed on the grant. So there are certain things that they want you to do. Teach resilience, teach, going back to work or GED completion or whatever it is. So typically there are rules. And in our shelter, there were rules. And the clients had chores assigned. It was a home-like setting. And so they were responsible for doing chores and things like that. And that's fine. And I don't have a problem with that. No problem with that whatsoever, especially when you have many, many families occupying the same place. But this is what I observed from my staff, who I believe were caring people and who wanted to help people, right? And this is why they were working in human services. But they would do things like, well, Annie, your chore was to do the dishes, and you didn't do them. And so that's one demerit. And you can only get 3 demerits before we put you out of the shelter. Okay? So then, the next day, Annie spends all day catching public transportation, trying to get from point A to point B, getting a runaround, being told she needs this document and that document, but the abuser has it and won't give it to her. She comes back to the shelter only to be told, you didn't put your kids' toys away. That's another demerit. And you only get 3 demerits before you get put out of the shelter. What do you think that feels like? What does it feel like to have escaped with your children, a few of their toys, and the clothes on your back, and whatever you could cram into a hefty bag? Navigate this system, call and ask me, can you come to the shelter? I determine I have beds for you and your children, and when you get there, you're being harassed by staff about the dishes and picking up your kids' toys. You've been on public transportation all day. You had to borrow money to catch the bus. It's hot outside. You're dragging children with you because we don't babysit, okay? And you have to be out looking for work. And when you come back, the first thing you're going to hear from us is, you have 2 demerits. And if you get another demerit, we're going to put you out of the shelter. This is how our systems are set up. And so we can have a system in place that further victimizes the victims that we say we're committed to helping. So that's just one example. I could give you countless examples. You had an appointment for job placement, but you didn't make the appointment because you were late. You were late because you couldn't find your baby's bottle. So you missed the bus, which meant you had to wait an hour to catch another bus. That made you late for your appointment. And the job placement people said, well, your appointment was at 10 o'clock and it's 12 o'clock now, so we can't see you today. So now you have to come back to the shelter on another bus, right? Hauling your baby because we don't babysit. And when you get back, we want to give you a demerit because you missed your job placement appointment. And one of the things that qualifies you for being in this shelter is you have to be actively seeking employment and keeping your appointments. You all understand what I'm saying? So we'll set systems in place that further traumatize those that we say that we want to help. And this is the norm. This is the norm. So we're not talking about people who typically have vehicles, and if they do have a vehicle, do they have money to put gas in the vehicle? Are the tires bald on the car? Did the abuser vandalize the vehicle somehow? Are the tags expired on the car? Do they have current registration? And if they don't, where are they going to get the money for that? And so there are all of these obstacles that the homeless face, and a large percentage of them are fleeing domestic violence. So what am I saying? In our interaction with them, we need to be mindful that we are not traumatizing them all over again. All over again. Because in effect, what happens is this. They leave one place where someone's trying to control their every move, right? Control their life. And they come into a system where now the entire system is doing the same thing. So they've exchanged one abuser for another is what they've done. They've exchanged one abuser for another. Okay? And so we want to operate in compassion. We want to operate in understanding. And those of us who are in a position to get some of these crazy rules changed. So I changed those rules. We're not putting anybody out of the shelter because they got back late. We're not evicting anybody with a baby, okay, because they missed their job placement appointment because they couldn't find the baby's bottle. That's absurd. And it undermines our entire purpose. So how are we accomplishing what we set out to accomplish if we are the reason that she becomes homeless again? Okay? So now there's a difference between that and You come into a shelter and you're causing problems. But even then, why are you causing problems? What is going on with you? And here's something to consider. If you've been in a situation in which you are contending with domestic violence, right? You're getting hit on, you're getting threatened, weapons waved in your face, beat up, cursed out, called everything but what your mother named you. You don't even know what your name is anymore. It's been so long since they said it appropriately, right? When you get to a place where you feel like you just may be safe, you are exhausted, you are depleted, you are anxious, and you just praying to God you're not going to have to get abused anymore right now. So what do you need? You need sleep. You need sleep. You need nutritious meals. You need sleep. You need support. And you don't need to be badgered about how many, infractions you may have because you didn't wash the dishes. You need compassion. And so we need to do a better job of that. Even when we set systems in place, we torture people all over again, okay? 33% of homeless women have been victims of severe assault by their current or most recent intimate partner. And here's the other thing. Oftentimes, they'll come snooping around trying to find them, looking for them, hunting for them, looking for their vehicle, checking every shelter to see if they're there, calling and pretending to be people that they aren't. All of that. And no one knows better than the victim what the abuser is capable of. They know if they're not in denial about who this person is and the damage that they've already caused them, they know what they're capable of. And so they live with this constant fear, okay? Now, by the age of 12, 83% of homeless children have been exposed to at least one serious violent event. By the age of 12, they've been exposed to one serious one. We're not talking about the abuser calling their mama a name. We're talking about serious, but they have witnessed violence at least one time before the age of 12. And those are formative years. That's the time frame where you determine how safe the world is, how trustworthy people are, if you're going to ever be safe yourself, okay? Mothers experiencing homelessness have 3 times the rate of PTSD and 2 times the rate of drug and alcohol dependence. About 50% of mothers experienced a major depressive episode since becoming homeless. So on top of the depression and the stress and the anxiety and the PTSD that they experience in the situation, they become homeless, which strips you of everything you thought you had to be safe. And the thing about homelessness is this: it doesn't matter how much you have acquired in the past. When you hit that homeless category, none of that matters. You've lost all of it, and whatever you didn't lose, you're trying to haul it from place to place with you. It's demoralizing, it is depressing, and then again, systems are needed, as Eloise said, but then the way they're set up, they just further traumatize people, okay? They have ulcers at 4 times the rate of other women. So now you're talking about developing, physical ailments on top of emotional ailments, on top of being homeless, on top of having zero self-esteem, right? And having all these crazy rules. Every agency that you go to, they've got a list of rules, do's and don'ts. The paperwork is unbelievable, okay? I don't know about you. I hate filling out stuff. Applications, I can't. You can almost keep, whatever it is, you can almost have it. And I'm educated. And I just cannot. I hate it. I hate filling out applications. With a passion, I have to prepare mentally to go fill out an application for anything. Because I just hate it. I don't like doing it. I just don't like doing it. So imagine if you're not equipped to do it. Imagine if mentally, psychologically, emotionally, you are depleted and you're being asked 10 million questions. Asked for numbers and dates and times, and you almost don't even know what the day is today. And you've got to go back through all of this. Hope that the person that's helping you is truly interested in helping you and not just checking off on their list that they dealt with you, okay? And it's very, very stressful. It's incredibly stressful, okay? It's important to note, thank you, Lord, that when we're talking about abusers, right? When we're talking about fathers that abuse or intimate partners that abuse, and we're going to reference males at this point, that the profiles of fathers who abuse extends beyond the obvious characteristics, right? Of being loud and rude and uncouth, as my mother used to say, being aggressive and demanding and controlling. But it also includes fathers that are emotionally or physically detached from their children, who are not involved in their children's lives, who, if their physical body is involved, emotionally they're not engaged at all with their children. And fathers from low-income backgrounds who have fathered children in 2 or more relationships that ended in infidelity or domestic violence. Because if you're talking about a parental figure, in this instance we're talking about fathers who have fathered children in many different places, okay, how emotionally connected can he truly be? If the partner with which he made these children, he's not been able to form a stable relationship with. So the example is not a good one, number one. And infidelity would indicate an inability or unwillingness to commit and stay committed, right? It's an indication that you've made a promise and you violated it. You disrespected your relationship. You disrespected your partner. And the statistics show that when relationships continually end in infidelity or in domestic violence, that father is, the majority of the time, emotionally detached and uninvolved in the lives of his children. Okay? According to endhomelessness.org, which is an arm of the National Alliance to End Homelessness, a domestic violence experience is common among the homeless and is often the precursor to homelessness. So again, we kind of go back to that original question that I asked when we first came on here. When you see a homeless person, what assumptions do you make about how they became homeless? And somebody on who's probably thinking, well, some of them just want to be home. But why do they prefer to be out there? What is it? What has been their life experience, right? That living on the street is preferable. That they would rather be on the street. They would rather shuttle from shelter to shelter. They would rather do that than to be where? Where is it that they are choosing not to be when they choose to be on the street, okay? What set of circumstances are they avoiding, right? We talked about how domestic violence affects us, how it affects us emotionally, how it impacts our brain. And when you think about that and how it negatively impacts your ability to discern a safe place, to discern what happened to you in the past regarding and as compared to what's happening in life right now, your ability to cope, your ability to manage. If a person finds themselves cycling from one domestic violence situation to another, and they're being negatively impacted by this, what they never learn is how to build a healthy relationship. And what they never have an opportunity to do because of ongoing trauma is to allow their brain to heal so that they can begin to make better choices and so that their discernment can be increased, okay? The most immediate need of a domestic violence victim, whether they are a child or an adult, is safety. That's the number one primary need. And many times they feel safer homeless than they do with the abuser. And then oftentimes when we talk about the economic impact of a domestic violence situation, if they involve law enforcement and the abuser is arrested and they were dependent on the abuser for finances, doesn't necessarily mean that they're not working, but most households in America today takes 2 people working to maintain it at a paycheck to paycheck base. You know, just to make it from paycheck to paycheck, you need 2 people working in the house, right? If one of them is not working for whatever reason, you are teetering on the edge of homelessness. Teetering on the edge of homelessness, okay? And so it's not a reflection of a person's character that they're homeless. And it's important that we understand that. According to Pew Charitable Trust, every other year, and I recall this from when I was a shelter director, but every other year there is a point in time study or survey that is done of the homeless in the major areas of the United States, okay? In Philadelphia, Charlotte, New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, because in order for these cities, for these communities to qualify for grant money from the federal government, they have to give a relative head count of how many homeless they have in their areas. And so literally for a 24-hour period, you have people in the streets counting the homeless. They are counting them in the shelters. They are counting them under the bridge. They are counting them by the banks of the river. They are going into trap houses or wherever they know that they reside and counting them. And these numbers are crunched over a 24-hour period. So they count, like I said, the ones who live in shelters. They count the ones who live in places that are not even fit for human habitation. And those who work with the homeless population tend to know kind of where they hang out, where they stay, where they sleep. All right. And so this is how monies are allocated. And right now in this country, we're looking at monies for supporting the homeless, helping the homeless are being cut. They're being cut, which means that there are services that they need that they will not get. Emergency services are typically limited in scope in terms of days. You might be able to stay 7 days. You might be able to stay 14 days. You may be able to stay 30 days. That's pushing it, okay? Then you have transitional housing, which allows the homeless to stay for a longer period of time, okay, which gives them an opportunity to gain some stability. All right, unless the abuser finds out where they are and starts stalking them and causing problems at the shelter, unless funding for the shelter runs out, unless you're dealing with staff who are not compassionate and are really focused on counting the infractions and not understanding the frame of mind that this homeless person may be in and the stressors that they're dealing with, okay? And so they have a lot to contend with. Okay? Beginning in 2018, when they started what they called the point-in-time studies, which is what I was telling you, they crunched numbers. Usually it's the last several days in the month of January that these numbers are crunched. And then they're all funneled to the federal government, and that's how it's determined how much money they give to different areas. But for the first time in 2018, it will include the question, are you fleeing domestic violence? Because what they have realized is they weren't asking the right questions. So all these years we've known that people were homeless and maybe they had a drug addiction or maybe they had an alcohol problem or maybe they lost their employment. But no one was asking, are you fleeing domestic violence? Are you homeless because you cannot stay at home safely? And so with that information, then maybe funding can be allocated more specifically to assist those who are domestic violence victims, intimate partner violence victims, who are homeless because they cannot safely stay at home, okay? Because Housing and Urban Development realized that although they knew that people were homeless, they didn't know why. They didn't know why they were homeless, okay? Are you homeless simply because you lost your job and you weren't able to find another job and you've missed your rent, you couldn't pay your mortgage, you had to file bankruptcy, or are you really just trying to stay alive and so you had to leave home, okay? More than 1/3 of domestic violence survivors report becoming homeless immediately after separating from their partners. Now, here's some of the things that can happen. Even if a domestic violence victim is working, hey, Lori, even if they're working, the abuser knows where you work. The abuser can harass you on your job, create a scene on your job, make your employer uncomfortable because you're hanging out in the parking lot and won't leave, right? jeopardizing the victim's ability to earn a living. And it's intentional. And it's designed to drive them back home, to drive them back to a place where they're under the control of the abuser. All right? And so think about your place of employment. How would your employer respond if you had an ex-partner calling all of the time, calling and being disrespectful and belligerent to whoever answered the phone, demanding to see you, lurking in the parking lot, making veiled threats? Would you maintain your employment? You know, several months ago, we did a Facebook Live regarding domestic violence and when it converges on the workplace. And I told you then that 60 to 65% of employers in the United States do not even have a domestic violence policy on the books. They don't have one. And if they do have one, the only person who knows what it says is human resources, who's probably not the person answering the phone with the multiple phone calls, right? So think about how long you would keep your employment if someone were to do that. Call a job and create confusion. Call a job and make verbal threats. Call a job and say, I'm going to blow the place up. Call a job and say, I'm in the parking lot. You know, somebody better go home with you because I'm following you. They have an employee that's being stalked. What would your employer do to ensure your safety? Would they assume any responsibility for it at all? Or would they start nitpicking about the fact that you were late again today and not be concerned about the fact that you were trying to not get followed all the way to work? Not be concerned about the fact that when you came out of the house, the tire was flat on your car, so then you couldn't get to work, or something was put in the engine block of your vehicle, or any number of things that a person can do that cause you to be late, to cause you to be distracted, because now, okay, so maybe you got to work without incident. Are you going to be able to go to lunch without incident? Are you jeopardizing your coworkers if they see you with a coworker? So if your employment becomes fragile and you've left the abuser, what does that leave you? If you don't have a very understanding boss with a policy in place to ensure the safety of yourself and your coworkers, okay, they could be concerned about a workplace violence scenario taking place. They could be concerned about a murder-suicide taking place on their property. They would be concerned about a potential lawsuit. All right? And so for some employers, it's better for you to not work there than for you to bring the threat to them every time you clock into work. And so if, as a victim, you lose your employment, now you have no income. You have two options, well, maybe three. You can try to go to a shelter, and I can tell you, most shelters have waiting lists. I'm telling you what I know. I've bent that waiting list and stretched that building to capacity more times than I could count because I just couldn't leave people out there with their babies, right? So you go to a shelter, hope that they don't penalize you because the time to call for a bed is, the cutoff is 4 p.m. and now it's 5, okay? If you can't get into a shelter, is there anywhere else you can stay? And if you can stay with your friend, how long can you do that before they're kind of tired of you being on their couch and being underfoot and being sad and depressed? How long before they get tired of that? You understand what I'm saying? And so what option does that leave you? You either become homeless, right? Or you go back to the abuse. All right? And so that's the reality. That is the reality. Okay? So the most significant need for a homeless person who has experienced domestic violence is safety. They need a safe place to lay their head, and they need to not be harassed and re-traumatized while they're there. The next thing that they might need is transitional housing to help them to gain some stability, to give them a little bit longevity in the place so that they can kind of stabilize and heal and make a plan to move forward. Approximately 1 in 4 women, and I believe it's probably even higher than that, are homeless because of domestic violence specifically. Okay, specifically. And so this is why it's important to have a safety plan. These are all things that a person who's in a domestic violence situation, whether they're male or female, wants to consider when you first start seeing those red flags. If you're not ready to pack your grip and get out of there, you need to think about, what if the bottom falls out of this thing? What if this train jumps the track? How am I going to live? What safeguards do I need in place? How can I save a little bit of money over time, discreetly, so that I'm not in a position where I'm literally running for my life and I'm on the street with nowhere to go? Okay? So, according to the Housing and Urban Development's report that they released in 2017, they said that nearly 40% of intimate partner violence survivors will become homeless. 40%. So of all the people who are victims of intimate partner violence, 40% of them will eventually become homeless, okay? More than 80%, according to them, of mothers and children are domestic violence survivors. So 40%, more than 80% of the homeless mothers with children are domestic violence survivors. All right? A woman's not going to just leave her home with her children in tow and go to a shelter and sleep in a place with strangers, or sleep under a bridge somewhere, sleep in a homeless encampment and don't even know who's out there for no reason. Something's wrong where she was living, and she determined that she could no longer live there under those conditions, okay? Women who leave violent or abusive relationships are more likely to live in poverty and are at high risk of eviction due to financial vulnerability. Because by the time they leave, they typically don't have savings. And if they do have savings, it's not an endless supply of savings. And if they do have savings and they are employed, the abuser still knows where they work. So now we're looped back into that same scenario that we were talking about before, right? So the abuser knows where they are. The abuser can threaten their employment anytime they feel like it, and they are at the mercy of their employer regarding how involved the employer wants to be, okay? And as I said, the majority of employers in this country don't even have a domestic violence policy that's viable. They may have something on the books. But does anybody know what it is? Does the victim know that it exists? Does the victim know what their options are and what kind of help and support they can get from their employer, okay? As I said before, many lose their jobs due to circumstances related to their abuse. And, you might be thinking, well, is that legal? That's not legal. Is it a right to work state? Don't they have to have a reason to do it? Your only option, if you are terminated unfairly, right, is to try to file a suit of some sort, which, even if you won, could take 2 to 3 years. That's if you won. But here's the question. If you are homeless, who has money for an attorney? Who has money for an attorney? Who has the wherewithal and the mental stamina to deal with a lawsuit when they're homeless? Okay? Because they're already in a fragile state. Hey, Shamika. Okay, so many women fear losing their children if they leave the abuser and cannot provide stable housing. So that's another threat. So that's a reason oftentimes why women stay, even when they know that they're in an abusive situation, because leave and take the children and go where? In some instances, they can go to try to get, help from the state. And sometimes the abuser has beat them to it and told lies. And so now the thing is, well, I'm going to call CPS because you have the kids and you're out there in the street with them. And they leave out the part that, well, we're out in the street because you keep hurting us, okay? And so these are all things that, a person who's fleeing abuse, like I said, the primary need that they have is for safety. They need safety, they need compassion, they need a safe place to live, they need to be able to rest and to heal and to stabilize, right? They need support and not an endless list of demands and rules and regulations and being threatened with infractions, because essentially, when we handle them that way, we have become the abuser. The system has become the abuser, okay? So, in 2015, I thought this was interesting. In 2015, in a single day, the National Network to End Domestic Violence tracked over 31,500 requests for help from domestic violence shelters. Lack of resources and funding resulted in 12,197 of those being unmet. So 31,500 requests were received for services from domestic violence shelters, right? And a lack of resources resulted in only 12,000, that's not even half, 12,197 of those being unmet. 63% of those unmet were for housing. So the majority of the time when shelters receive requests, right, for housing, the most of the time they're having to tell people no. They're having to turn people away. I would tell people when they were going to go to a different shelter, because you learn the ins and outs, they don't let you check in until 4 o'clock. So you need to be in line before 12 noon, because the line's going to be wrapping around that building and half of y'all are not going to get a bed. And if you're not in line on time, you will not get a bed. And if you come back late, you will not get a bed. And if you break a rule, you'll lose the bed you have. And so it's so tedious and it's so punitive. The underpinnings are so punitive, right? And these are for people that we're supposed to be trying to help. In contrast, 5,000, there are 5,000. Now, y'all know I'm an animal lover, right? But just think about this. In contrast, there are 5,000 animal shelters that exist across the United States, right? 5,000 compared to 1,500 domestic violence shelters. We have 1,500 domestic violence shelters across the country and 5,000 animal shelters. Think about that. Now, I'm not saying we should have fewer animal shelters. I'm not saying that animals are not important. I am an animal lover. But something's off kilter here, okay? So the purpose of this Facebook Live is just to raise awareness regarding the plight of those who find themselves homeless, and to make sure that we are being sensitive to the fact when we're making these judgment calls out here, when we see people out here with all their, worldly belongings that they have left in a grocery bag or a hefty bag or in a shopping cart, that a large percentage of them are fleeing domestic violence situations. And the system is really not conducive to healing for them the way it is set up. It's not conducive to healing. And so what can be done about it? Education, raising awareness, extending some compassion, extending some grace. I'm not saying be foolhardy. I'm not saying go to your nearest homeless shelter, your nearest homeless camp under the bridge and bring them all to your house. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying let's be a little bit more compassionate and understand that if you got 40 to 50% of these people who are homeless because the alternative was to continue to be sexually assaulted, to continue to be verbally abused, to continue to be threatened and intimidated, to have weapons waved in your face, to continue to deal with strangulation to the point that you lose consciousness or not, to be subjected to abuse that is covert and that is done in such a way that it doesn't leave any marks, right? Being isolated from a support system, being isolated from loved ones, finding yourself in a position where you're lying and making excuses and covering up, leaving the victim with no options but to literally become homeless in order to just try to live. And when I say try to live, I mean to breathe. We're not even talking about having a reasonable quality of life. If living on the street or living in a shelter and dealing with endless rules and navigating systems that are not sensitive to what a survivor needs is preferable to being home, something is very wrong at home. Something is very wrong at home. All right? So we appreciate you all taking the time to tune in. We are committed. It's a daunting task, but it's important, and lives are at stake. Lives are at stake. Just yesterday, I posted a story about a 30-something-year-old man who broke into his ex-wife's house, broke into her house, shot and killed his own 18-month-old baby. But before he did that, he asked this question: are all y'all ready to die today? This is what he asked his family. Y'all ready to die? He broke in and asked them this question. Strangled the mother until she lost consciousness. I believe he probably thought he had killed her. Then shot and killed his 18-month-old son. The mother was able to regain consciousness and escape the house with a daughter. But these are the kinds of scenarios that people are dealing with. And so even once they leave, they're not safe. And we've got to do better. We have to pay attention. Lives are at stake. So you think about the fact that this little girl, I think she's 8 or 9 years old, was in the house when all of this happened. Her baby brother was killed by his father. What kind of message does that send to a young girl about her ability to maintain her own safety as she gets older? To know that her mother was strangled. It's just the trauma associated with that is huge. And she's going to need help to process that. And even then, she will probably have issues and problems and struggles in relationships because her brain has been affected by what she has observed and been exposed to. And this is after the mother left him. So God only knows what happened that spurred the mom to leave in the first place. Okay? So I want to leave you with this thought. If you find yourself in a domestic violence situation, it is critically important. Hey, Cassie, it is critically important that you have a safety plan, right? I'm not debating with you about if you love him to pieces or you love her to pieces and you just can't see life without him and the sun rises and sets in him. You still need a safety plan. While the sun is rising and setting, you need a safety plan so that you can continue to enjoy sunrises and sunsets, okay? You need a safety plan. When you decide you are ready to leave, you need a safety plan. And the safety plan involves more than I'm going to my cousin's house if things get bad. What does that mean if things get bad? What has to happen for you to be sure that it's time to exit? These are all things that you want to think about. And so I want to encourage you to actually connect with a domestic violence advocate, someone outside of your situation who can help you to process and plan to stay safely for as long as possible or to exit as safely as possible. I also want to reiterate that the most dangerous time, right, is when you are actually physically exiting that residence, because it's the time when the abuser is clear that they've lost control, okay? And they're not trying to lose control. That's what the entire abuse cycle is about, power and control. Then 30 to 90 days after that, you are in increasing danger, okay? You're in increasing danger. The 30 to 90 days is a process that you want to associate with the abuser's thought process and not your own. If you call law enforcement, and you certainly should if it's warranted, but if you call law enforcement and say they are arrested, the 90 days, that 30 to 90 days period doesn't really begin for them until they are back to their life and they realize that they've lost control of you. So really, 30 to 90 days from the time that you left, that they were released, you are in heightened danger. And certainly it can go longer than that. Well, what's the solution? To get out as soon as you can and understand that you can be involved with someone for 2 or 3 months. If they are sick enough and you try to leave, it could be very triggering for them. So don't make the mistake of trying to be rational about it, because abusers are not rational people. They're not rational. They want what they want. They want power and control. And anything less than complete and utter power and control is not satisfying to them. Okay? And so you want to be thoughtful. You want to be connected to someone who can maintain a level head and help you think through your planning and be a support to you, okay? And that is vitally, vitally important. You can always call the domestic violence hotline. You can reach out to Stand Up Survivors, which is a phenomenal Facebook support group. There are domestic violence awareness groups on Facebook that you can join. We have a faith-based closed group called Dominion Over Domestic Violence. And especially if you're a ministry leader or someone who has many other people submitted to your voice and you have a history of domestic violence, or you just want to lend support in our group, then you are more than welcome. And if you join the group and decide, you know what, I think I need some support myself, that's okay too, because we are very supportive and encouraging and loving over there, okay? I know that there is life on the other side of this thing. We have got to use wisdom in terms of how we navigate it. We've got to stop people of faith over spiritualizing things and getting all deep and mystical and sprinkling fairy dust, because people are dying. And I'm going to say that oftentimes people die not because they don't listen to clergy, not because they didn't listen to their pastor, but because they did. Because they did. And they received advice that was not wise. They received advice based on experience only and not training, right? And not led of God in terms of the advice that they are given. For those of you who may be talking to people or counseling people who are struggling with domestic violence, who find themselves ensnared in that situation, be mindful that, number one, you should never counsel the two of them at the same time. Do not do that. Don't do that. You are setting someone up to get hurt, okay? And sometimes I think, for clinicians, for therapists, for pastors, for clergy, our need to see a situation healed overrides what's best for the people involved in the situation. So you never counsel the victim and the abuser at the same time, in the same room, in the same session. Because chances are, when the abuser even learns that the victim is talking to you, they're going to get beat down for it. They're going to be verbally abused for it. They're going to be assaulted, sexually assaulted. Something bad's going to happen simply because they know that they've been talking to you at all. So confidentiality is key. Key. And you never share with the abuser what the victim has said. You never ever do that. Don't do that. All right? And if the abuser sits in front of you and says, "I'm so sorry. I repent. I didn't mean it," you still don't have a right to expose the victim to that. You still don't, okay? And so one of the things, and I'm feeling led to say this, one of the things that we have to guard against as those who offer counseling and offer, clergy support to people is not using our own value system and saying, wow, well, he said he was sorry and he cried and he wrote this beautiful letter and he stood up in front of the church and he repented and he said he was wrong and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Classic abusive shenanigans. Classic. Textbook. Okay? So the fact, what am I saying? The fact that maybe they said something that made you feel better as the counselor, made you feel like you got an S on your chest, made you feel like, well, I got a rapport with them. I know they kind of rough around the edges. I know that they come from a hard background, but I have a good rapport with them. I'm anointed in that area. Don't you believe that? Don't you believe that? if it's too much of what you want to hear, I can just about guarantee you it's not the truth. It's not the truth. All right? When a person is truly repentant, because sorry means I'm embarrassed because I got caught. Sorry means I'm a little frustrated because my image has been tarnished. Sorry means that I'm uncomfortable about being held accountable, and I don't really want to be uncomfortable, so I'm going to say whatever I need to say to make this go away, right? That's not repentance. Repentance is, I hurt you. I recognize that I hurt you. It bothers me that I hurt you. And I'm willing to do what I need to do to establish that I'm a changed person. And that's not going to happen overnight. And let me tell you this. An abuser who's just blowing smoke and trying to manipulate will have a checklist in their head. Well, now you said I need to attend 5 Bible studies, right? And I need to go to batterers intervention training, and I need to get my diploma from that program saying that I promise not to hit anybody ever again. And I need to recognize that I was dropped on my head at birth, and that I cussed too much, and that I need to stop smoking weed, or whatever it is. They're going to run through the checklist. They're not going to internalize a cotton-picking thing. And then they'll post back up in your office and say, well, I did everything on the list. I did all. Now, you said I needed to do this, and I did it. And now I want my family back. Okay? Something I learned a long time ago. If you want to know, and this is not out of a therapy book, if you want to know what you are truly dealing with, tell it no and wait. It'll show up. It'll show up. A person who is truly repentant will understand. I did a horrible thing. I hurt another person. And I had control over the input, but I don't have any control over the outcome. And I may not like that I don't have control over the outcome, but I accept that I don't have any right to try to control the outcome. I have no right to tell this person when they should forgive me, when they should forget all this stuff happened, when they should accept me back into their life, if they should accept me back into their life. I relinquished my control when I lost control. A person who is truly repentant may not like that answer, but they will accept that true accountability means that maybe this relationship is beyond repair, and that's my handiwork. I did that. It's rare that you will find an abuser that is capable of actually doing that, because in their mind, they've not done anything wrong. And they're really just humoring you by going through this checklist, okay? But their focus has not been a changed heart. Their focus has been to regain control. And the cycle of abuse is just like any other addiction. It picks right back up where it left off. So if he's been beating her, he's not going to just go back to cussing her out every now and then when he gets upset. He's going to go right back to beating her. Okay? And so we need to use wisdom. We need to understand what our own blind spots are. What is it that we really want to hear as helpers of mankind? And be wary. Be cautiously optimistic. Be a little bit skeptical if you hear too much of what you want to hear as a helper. If what you're hearing from the other person is too on point, if it's too precise, it is probably disingenuous, okay? All right. Does anybody have any questions? I appreciate you all tuning in. We are doing this live from Norfolk. We'll be back on the plane tomorrow, taking off again. So we covered your prayers. Continue to keep us lifted. We've got so much to do. We've had an amazing time here in Norfolk. We were able to network and connect with other advocates, and just excited about what God is doing, the synergy that was present in the room, and the genuine and care and concern, for those that God has charged us to take care of and to encourage and to undergird. So just remember that Most of the time when a woman is homeless, she became homeless not long after leaving her abuser because the finances were intertwined, because her job has been threatened, because her mental health has crashed and she's not able to maintain her job or to function on her job, because she doesn't have transportation back and forth, or she doesn't have childcare or whatever. And let's be less judgmental, okay? There is a definite correlation between domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and homelessness. All right? So we will be back with you on next week. If you want to partner with us, I did put it at the top of the screen. Our Cash App is $Judas Roar, with Roar spelled ROARRR. And our Cash App is our PayPal is paypal.me/Judas Roar. We are absolutely good soil. We are preparing our curriculum so that we can travel with them. And we are anticipating in the spring of next year beginning to travel overseas. We have invitations to Kenya and to Solomon Islands and a few other places that we have accepted ministry assignments in order to raise awareness and to lend some support and encouragement regarding domestic violence. According to the United Nations, a report that they released in 2017, they stated that the deadliest place for a woman worldwide is in her own home. Okay? So we've got to get ahead of this thing. And I'm convinced that if we join forces and we lock arms and remain prayerful and steadfast and unmovable, we can save lives. We can save lives, all right? I'm convinced of that. I believe it. I just believe God. I believe God. But this is what I know. We are his hands and feet in the earth, okay? He's not going to sprinkle fairy dust while we sit back and chill or hear a horrible story and say, oh no, oh my God, and do a sad emoji and go back to our life, okay? What are we doing to be salt and to be light for those who are plagued by domestic violence, for those who have been caught in the aftermath of it, right? So let's do all that we can do, and we can all do more, and we are committed to doing as much as we can do for as long as we possibly can, so that people can experience the love of God and peace in their life and to live life abundantly, because that was the whole purpose that Jesus died. I mean, he died so that we could have abundant life and so that we would not spend eternity separated from God the Father. Amen. So this is Apostle Cheryl Richardson. We appreciate you tuning in, and we will be back with you on next week. Now, we don't know where we'll be broadcasting from, wherever God says, but we'll be back next week. Blessings to you.